They say retirement is the reward after a life of hard work, but for me, it was the beginning of real freedom. No more deadlines, no more schedules, just me, my tools, and the rhythmic clatter of socket wrenches in my personal Havona custom-built steel workshop nestled behind my modest home at the edge of Oak Hollow Estates. I wasn't a recluse, just a man who liked his space. 40 years as a mechanic for the State Highway Patrol had taught me the value of precision and peace. My workshop was more than a garage, it was a sanctuary where I rebuilt vintage motorcycles, quiet, focused, therapeutic work. I had a couple of loyal friends in the neighborhood, mostly older folks who respected boundaries. We all got along fine. Until Karen moved in. Karen Halbrook arrived like a thunderstorm, loud, overbearing, and impossible to ignore. She introduced herself at the HOA's quarterly barbecue with a tone that reminded me more of a courtroom than a cookout. "I'm here to make this neighborhood the cleanest and most orderly in the county," she announced, clipboard in hand. No exceptions. It wasn't long before her reign began. Citations for unapproved fencing, warnings about mailbox heights, notices about untrimmed flora that were barely taller than her garden gnomes. The HOA meetings became one woman shows her voice, the only one that ever truly got heard. Stayed out of it. Karen tried to slap me with a violation once for improper workshop usage, but my deed clearly outlined my rights. My land sat just a few feet outside the HOA's jurisdiction line, technically part of Oak Hollow, but not under their thumb. That drove her nuts. Still, I didn't poke the bear. I kept to myself until she brought the fight to my door. Literally, it was a Monday morning when I found her Lexus RX sitting inside my workshop. I stood frozen at the doorway. The overhead roll-up door had been opened without my input, and her luxury SUV now rested right where I'd laid out the disassembled engine of a 1970 Norton Commando. My bike frame had been knocked over, tools scattered across the floor like someone had stormed through in a hurry. My first thought, break-in, maybe theft, but nothing was missing. Just chaos and a parked car that didn't belong. I marched across the cul-de-sac, rage boiling just beneath my skin. Karen answered her door with a green smoothie in one hand and smugness dripping from every pore. "You parked in my workshop," I said, my voice tight. She tilted her head like she was doing me a favor. "That structure doesn't comply with HOA visibility standards, and since your land is technically part of the original subdivision plan, it falls under shared emergency access. I've already documented it." My jaw tightened. "That's trespassing." "Karen," she took a casual sip, "then call the cops. But until then, it's staying there. Maybe it'll help you understand that private property doesn't exempt you from community responsibility." I walked away, fists clenched. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her brand of power didn't come from legal authority. It came from arrogance and the assumption that no one would challenge her. I called the HOA board. Useless, all her allies. They parroted the same nonsense about unified enforcement and communal assets. I brought up the deed. They asked if I could just compromise for neighborhood harmony. Karen had invaded my sanctuary and vandalized it with entitlement. That night, I sat inside the dimly lit shop, staring at her Lexus as it sat smug and silent beneath the flickering overhead bulb. Around me, the disassembled engine parts lay like wounded soldiers waiting for command, and for the first time since retirement, I felt the old instincts returning, the kind that don't settle for polite conversation. Karen had crossed a line. She didn't understand boundaries. She didn't respect space, but I did, and I had a welding torch as I powered down the shop lights and locked the side door behind me. A quiet plan began to form, one weld at a time. Something told me she wouldn't enjoy being inside my workshop nearly as much as she thought she would. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to file another complaint. I wasn't going to argue with the HOA board, or wave my property deed like a white flag. No, I was done playing nice. Karen wanted control, but she'd made one critical mistake. She trespassed on land she didn't own. Worse, she desecrated the one place that mattered to me, and that meant the gloves were off. I pulled on my welding mask, fired up my old Lincoln Electric, and dragged 3 thick steel plates from the stack, leaning against the east wall. The garage door Karen had slipped her car through was about to become a tomb. I didn't care if she planned to come back and move it later. She had parked herself into a corner, and I was going to make sure she stayed there. The welder roared to life with a satisfying hiss, molten sparks lighting up the shop in bursts of orange and white. I started with the bottom of the roll-up door, 3 long passes, overlapping for strength. Then the edges. I wasn't in a rush. Every bead of hot metal hissed like punctuation. I was writing a message, letter by letter: "Do not trespass, ever again." By noon, the main bay door was completely sealed, shut. The only other access point, the side personnel door, was next. I clamped a heavy-duty steel crossbar over it, welded both ends directly to the frame, then tacked the lock shut for good measure. The entire operation took 5 hours. I used enough steel to reinforce a bunker, and when it was done, the workshop looked like it belonged in a war zone. My security cameras captured every minute. Satisfied, I cleaned my gloves, walked inside the house, and booked myself a trip. My old Airstream was still roadworthy, tucked behind the toolshed. I hadn't taken it out since the pandemic, but it purred to life like it missed me. I stocked it with dry goods, grabbed my fishing rod, and scribbled a quick note for the neighbor. Gone for a long overdue vacation. Watch the place. Cameras. On workshop secure. By sunset, I was halfway across the state line with a cold soda in my hand and a smile that hadn't touched my face in weeks. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. No HOA meetings, no violation letters, no Lexus parked in my sacred space, just open road and the sound of old country on the radio back in Oak Hollow, though I could only imagine the chaos. Karen probably returned that evening, expecting to find her shiny SUV untouched and waiting. Instead, she found the roll-up door welded tighter than a submarine hatch, and a side door sealed shut like a vault. If she tried the keypad, she'd discover the code had been changed. If she called the cops, she'd learn I'd already filed a digital trespass complaint with time-stamped footage of her breaking in. I wasn't on the run. I was simply on a well-earned break. 3 days passed before my phone rang. I let it go. 2 voicemail, then another call, then 20. Karen, the HOA board, even a local number I didn't recognize. I finally answered on day 5. It was Officer Darren Hughes. "Jim," he said, trying not to laugh, "I've got a situation here. You might want to explain." "Let me guess. Silver Lexus trapped. You welded her car inside your shop?" "No, officer," I replied calmly. "I secured my private property after an unauthorized vehicle was parked inside. I have footage of the trespass." He chuckled. "You know, she tried to claim you stole her vehicle. That's a bold claim for someone caught on camera committing a crime." Darren paused. "I'm not saying I don't see your side, but you know this is going to blow up, right?" "It already did, Darren. I just put the lid back on." He laughed again. "Well, she's losing it." Screamed something about a lawsuit, HOA violations, city code, whatever she could grab onto. But honestly, everyone's tired of her. I ended the call with a thank you and a promise to return when I was good and ready. That night I pulled into a quiet lakeside campground, lit a fire, and sat by the water with my boots kicked up and the stars overhead. Let Karen stew in her sealed workshop tomb. Let the HOA unravel while trying to spin her chaos into regulation. I had miles to go, fish to catch, and peace to reclaim. But deep down, I knew the real show hadn't started yet. Karen was cornered, and cornered people tend to lash out. By the time I returned home 10 days later, Karen's fury had reached critical mass. My neighbor, old Hank McKinley, met me at the gate with a lawn chair under one arm and a bag of popcorn in the other. "You missed a show," he said, grinning, like a kid fresh off a roller coaster. Karen's been circling like a shark with a limp. She even tried to get a tow truck to rip the door open, but the guy took one look at the welds and refused. I walked past him toward the workshop. The steel plates still gleamed untouched. My sign's private property, no access without owner consent, remained bolted in place, just as I'd left them. But the real damage had unfolded at the HOA clubhouse. Apparently, in my absence, Karen held an emergency meeting. She stood at the podium with a manila folder full of printed bylaws and a tablet loaded with security. CAM clips she claimed showed chronic code violations around the neighborhood. But instead of getting applause, she got a rebellion. People were fed up. She'd fined a retired teacher for having a bird bath 2 inches too tall, harassed a mother of 3 over sidewalk chalk, threatened to call animal control on a hamster because rodents aren't appropriate outdoor pets. Every grudge she'd built came crashing down. Even her allies on the board turned. Mr. Benson, the treasurer and a soft-spoken accountant, finally stood up and addressed the crowd. "This isn't about rules anymore," he said. "It's about control, and I think we've all had enough." Someone motioned to vote on removing her as president. It passed unanimously when I rolled back into town. The power dynamic had flipped. Karen no longer strutted down the street with a clipboard and sunglasses. She looked deflated, like a balloon that had lost its helium and was dragging along the sidewalk. Still, she hadn't given up completely. On the afternoon of my return, she marched up my driveway in a pair of beige flats and a stiff cardigan, waving a thick envelope like it was a royal decree. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," she snapped. "This isn't over." I raised an eyebrow. "Your car's still in my workshop. Want to settle that first?" She glared at me. "You vandalized community property." I laughed loud and long. "Karen, your vehicle was parked illegally on my land. The only community it belongs to is you and your ego." That shut her up. Later that week I received a letter from her attorney, a paralegal's letter on some online template service. It accused me of wrongful detainment of personal property and suggested I negotiate a fair settlement before pursuing litigation. I didn't even have to respond. My attorney Mitch, an old friend from the patrol days, handled it with a single certified reply. Attached were time-stamped video clips of Karen driving into my locked workshop, entering without permission, and damaging personal property. The letter cited trespassing laws, local property codes, and a very polite but clear warning: any legal pursuit would result in counterclaims for damages, fees, and criminal trespass charges. 2 days later, Karen folded through gritted teeth and a forced smile. She arranged for a private company to cut through the side access panel at her own expense. The process took 6 hours and left the SUV with scorch marks along the rear bumper. When the tow truck finally hauled it away, half the neighborhood stood across the street watching, quiet as statues. Karen didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The woman who once controlled every mailbox, lawn height, and trash can placement, now couldn't even reclaim her own car without public humiliation. After the fiasco, she went silent. No more emails, no more clipboard strolls. Her Karen glare still lingered, but it had no bite left. The HOA board moved on without her, and the community breathed easier. But justice hadn't fully landed yet. Karen wasn't used to losing, and something in her eyes told me despite her fall from grace she wasn't done trying to claw her way back. And that was fine because I wasn't done either. The workshop still bore the scars of war. Weld marks glinted along the seams like battle stripes. The cut panel from Karen's extraction sat propped against the wall, a mangled reminder of her arrogance. I considered tossing it, but something about it felt poetic, like a trophy. I got back to work. The Norton Commando engine, which had been scattered across the floor after Karen's little invasion, was finally reassembled. Piece by piece, cylinder by cylinder, I restored what she'd tried to disrupt. Every bolt I tightened was an act of reclamation. Every spark that fired from that engine, a declaration that I was back and unbothered. But Karen couldn't help herself. 2 weeks after her humiliation, she sent out a neighborhood-wide email. Subject line: a call to restore standards. She blamed toxic masculinity, emotional instability, and unchecked aggression for what she called a disturbing trend in community behavior. It was thinly veiled, just enough plausible deniability to avoid a defamation suit, but everyone knew who she meant. It backfired spectacularly. Neighbors she once terrified began replying with their own stories. Hank posted a photo of his unauthorized rain barrel and asked if the HOA would be refunding the $75 fine Karen slapped him with. Martha, the sweet widow 2 houses down, shared how Karen berated her for planting marigolds outside the color palette. Even Mr. Benson, the former treasurer, attached a scanned copy of the time Karen tried to evict his daughter's lemonade stand. By noon, the email thread had spiraled into a full-on roast. Karen didn't reply again. She wasn't just defeated, she was exiled. A week later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, and just like that, the storm passed. To mark the occasion, I hosted a backyard barbecue. It wasn't fancy, just a few folding tables, a rack of ribs, and the smell of charcoal rolling through the breeze. But it felt like a celebration of something deeper. Not just freedom from Karen, but a return to neighborliness, real community. The entire block showed up. Hank brought beer, Martha brought pie. Even Darren, the local officer, stopped by in plain clothes with a six-pack and a smirk. He asked if the workshop was accepting new inmates, and we all laughed harder than we had in months. Later that evening, with the fire pit crackling and the stars overhead, I rolled out my next project, a rusted-out '57 Chevy Bel Air that had been sitting under a tarp since before Karen moved in. Everyone gathered around as I pulled the cover off. Its frame was shot, paint long faded, and the engine was more rust than steel. But to me it was perfect, because just like this neighborhood, it needed care, restoration, someone who saw value in what others tried to control or discard. As folks trickled out one by one, I sat on a crate inside my workshop, staring at the old Chevy and sipping the last of my coffee. The place was quiet again. Safe mind. Karen was gone, but her presence left behind something. I hadn't expected clarity, I realized. I'd spent so long avoiding conflict that I'd nearly let someone erase the very thing I loved, my sanctuary, my peace. But standing up, even in a way most would call extreme, had reminded me that silence wasn't always strength. Sometimes we needed sparks, steel, fire. Sometimes you had to weld the damn door shut. The next morning I walked out to my mailbox and found a note taped to the flag that was from Karen. Congratulations. You turned an entire neighborhood against a woman who only wanted order. Enjoy the mess. I hope it rusts. I chuckled, folded the note, tossed it into the shop furnace without a second glance, let it burn. Rust was nothing to fear. Rust was just proof that something had lived, been used, weathered. And I had every tool to bring it back to life.